Okay, well, we'll make a start. So it's an absolute pleasure to be able to introduce Catherine and Weiyuan to do this seminar. I'll just go over a little bit of admin before I introduce them properly, but welcome to everybody. And as you know, I think this seminar will be recorded, and afterwards, with the permission of both speakers, we'll put it onto our Educational Research YouTube channel, so it'll be available to everybody. During the presentation, if you could all switch off your cameras and make sure your microphones are muted, that would be fantastic. The speakers will be speaking for around about 45 minutes. That will give us lots of time for questions afterwards. So when it comes to that point, please do turn your cameras back on and feel free to ask questions by just, raising your hand to indicate you want to do that, or put questions in the chat as well, and we can take them from there. But the kind of discussion session will be informal and open, so I'd encourage you to just kind of engage with that if you want to verbally. So it's, as I say, an absolute pleasure to introduce Catherine and Weiyuan. Catherine is a senior lecturer in education at the University of Manchester, and her research explores gender and sexualities inequalities in education and the effects or otherwise of educational inequalities initiatives. And she's currently researching wellbeing inequalities among LGBT young people in Greater Manchester. So welcome, Catherine. Weiyuan's a PhD candidate in education at the University of Manchester, and his project explores the experiences of LGBTQ school teachers in China, which is funded by the President's Doctoral Scholarship. And before coming to the UK, he worked as a Chinese language teacher in Shanghai for 6 years. So it's so great that you're both with us today. And you're going to be talking to the title of Inside the Chinese Heterosexual Matrix, Exploring Sexuality, Leader Identity and Agency Among Lesbian and Gay Mid-Level School Teachers in China. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you two, and thank you so much, and we're really looking forward to hearing what you've got to say and discussing it in due course.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Carolyn. I'll just share our screen. So we're going with this one, Google Slides. There we go. Seamless transition. So as Carolyn said, yeah, we're talking today about a paper that we're working on currently, sort of in progress at the moment, called Inside the Chinese Heterosexual Matrix. This is based on the findings from Ian's pilot study for his PhD. So for that study, Ian interviewed 3 teachers, and we've worked together for the first time as a sort of co-researching and writing team on this to look at developing this idea of a distinctly Chinese heterosexual matrix and what that might look like. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So just for an overview of the session, I'll just move this out of the way. We're going to start by, well, first of all, asking you to share any knowledge that you have already about the context of LGBT people in China. Ian will then speak a bit about some of the history of that context and the context of Chinese schools and how they operate quite distinctively. I'll talk a bit about previous research on LGBT leadership in the West and in China. And then we'll focus on the sort of key findings in this paper that we're working on. So we're looking at the experiences of 3 gay and lesbian mid-level school leaders in Chinese schools, and this is a group of people who previously haven't been heard from in the research so far, in the Chinese research. And we'll finish, as requested, with some of our research background and tips based on our experiences as a PhD student and academic so far in our careers. So to begin with, we wanted to just throw a question out to all of you and ask you to tell us, what do you know about the situation for LGBT people in China currently? And we have a Menti code, but also you're equally free to just write in the chat. But if you go to Menti and enter this code 23055476, anonymous results, no judgment, tell us what you know. The answer might be absolutely nothing, but we'll give you just 2 minutes to do that, and then we'll have a look at what answers come in. So I'll leave that code up on the screen for a second, and then I'll go over to Menti. But you should still be able to see it as well, actually.
Oh, this is very exciting.
Got to throw in some interactive elements.
Yeah, I've not used Menti before. Here, I'm having a go.
Great. Why did I put, yeah, good idea. So I'll put the code in the chat.
Yes, that's why I'm.
55476. And if I go over to Menti. The code has changed since I first did it. So new code at the top there, 55389074, in fact. So if you've already written something, we can ask you to do that with a different code this time. No idea what's happened there. And your responses will be completely anonymous, so they'll hopefully pop up on the screen, but we won't see who's written them.
This is great. This is very exciting.
Right.
Good to know. Nothing at all. Again, nothing, absolutely nothing to be ashamed of. It's good
Okay,
to
be
get,
1 second, please.
of course. Nothing, but I suspect it's not good. Give you another few seconds. There's 14 of us, so I'll wait until we've got a few. Right, very little I have assumptions. Feel free to write any of those assumptions in if you'd like. Again, it's all anonymous. Another 20 seconds, then we'll move on. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, that's really useful to know. I'm glad that we asked.
Yeah.
So I will pass over to Ian to speak a bit on that.
Okay, so on that note, I'm going to talk about the LGBT people in China. So give you a context of the LGBT people in China. So in China, actually, some progress has been made in recent years. For example, in 1997, homosexual acts were decriminalized, and in 2001, homosexuality was removed from the mental disorder list. Despite this progress, there's still no official legislation protecting LGBT rights. So this puts LGBT people in a legal gray area where they are not explicitly recognized by the Chinese law. So it's kind of like in the invisible position. So currently, the Chinese government's attitude towards LGBT issues can be summarized as 3 no's: not supportive, not encouraging, not against. So basically, LGBT people would be tolerated as long as they remain private and do not publicly demand equal rights or advocate for diversity and inclusion. So currently, there are some LGBT organizations in China, but they are focusing on family values, like promote good gays, good gay and lesbians, good family values. As long as these values are promoted, they'll be okay. So the public attitude towards LGBT people in China is also ambiguous. Many people adopted this ignorant or neutral stance, which can be summarized as, I respect LGBT people, but I don't want to see them in my life. So this attitude often masks discrimination under the guise of respect. So it is within this complex situation we conducted our research. I hope it's clear. Yeah, it's basically, it's like in the gray area. It's like it's in the position between not legal and legal. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Absolutely. And we should have said, please feel free to write questions in the chat as we go, or put your hand up and we're happy to clarify or answer as we go along, as well as at the end. So having said that, moving to the school context in particular.
Yes. So until now, so China's education system remains highly centralized and state governed, despite significant changes since the reform and opening up policy of 1978. So in 1985, the initial national education reform happened. It began delegating some state power to local governments and societal forces, allowing local entities to establish schools and develop non-co-curricula. It also introduced principal responsibility system, which make school leaders fully responsible for managing their schools. However, the central government retains ultimate power over education, such as through education legislations, teaching inspections, textbook scrutiny, and more recently, technology surveillance, such as CCTV on campuses. So as a result, the education system in China is still featured as conformity and uniformity, and there is minimal awareness and inclusion of gender and sexuality diversity. It is within this context that our LGBT participants are working. Yeah.
Yeah, so we were really interested to look at how Chinese school teachers and leaders are, or LGBT teachers and leaders in China in particular, are kind of navigating that really complex terrain, given everything Ian said about the level of social control and state surveillance, and continued prominence of homophobia and heteronormativity in China. So just to give a bit of background in terms of previous research in this area, there's lots and lots of research in the last few decades about LGBT leadership in the West. And this has kind of, in a very broad sense, moved from a focus on Griffin's idea of identity management. So in 1992, Pat Griffin did this research, which identified LGBT teachers as engaged in these daily processes of identity management, whereby they sort of used various strategies to navigate their sexual and professional identities, and primarily keep those two things separate because of perceptions of homosexuality as at odds with professional teaching identities. So those strategies were things like passing as straight, covering their gay or lesbian identity, employing like a super teacher identity that was above reproach, and others that we'll talk about in a bit. And then there's been a bit of a move to a more positive construction of LGBT leadership in recent years. So Catherine Lee has done lots of research with LGBT leaders, talking in particular about this idea of courageous leadership, where leaders are very purposefully bringing their sexual and professional identities together as an act of sort of authentic leadership practice, and using their experiences as LGBT people to actually enhance their leadership in a way that makes them, some of the time feel more able to connect with people, to recognize oppression, to challenge inequality, and so on. So in the Western context, there's this quite clear move from a sort of more negative construction to a more positive construction, with a continued recognition that being an LGBT teacher and leader continues to come with lots of challenges, with continued homophobia and heteronormativity. But in the Chinese context, the situation is really complex. So as Ian's already sort of indicated, the situation for LGBT people in China in general continues to be not a super positive one. There is no legal recognition of LGBT people. People are conscious of having LGBT friends or relatives, but that sort of legal recognition and acceptance is still very much not there. And actually, homophobia and heteronormativity are not only still really prevalent in China, but they're very explicitly endorsed by the Chinese Communist Party. So the perception of gay people as immoral, unnatural and wrong is something that the party state in China, will say explicitly and endorses. So that creates a very, clear legal sort of sanctioning of homophobia within China. And that means that the existing research in China about LGBT people, particularly within these sort of public sector institutions like schools, is really limited because it's a really dangerous context at the moment. There is an emerging field of research. So in particular, Sui has published a really brilliant string of articles, which we didn't even have space to fit on this slide. But if you look at this one, you'll find all the others. He's sort of leading the field at the moment in terms of the experiences of LGBT academics in universities. And he identifies universities as being a really key site for social control and political stability in China. So those processes that Ian talked about in terms of surveillance by the state are really, really prominent for gay academics in Chinese universities, where, you know, trying to sort of discreetly introduce LGBT topics into the classroom is met, you know, comes up against obstacles relating literally to CCTV surveillance, sort of people in the classroom reporting back to the Communist Party, Communist Party members within the university space. So really, really kind of risky, dangerous context, but great research being conducted nonetheless. And then there's more broadly some research emerging about public sector roles more generally, so things like social work roles. And Ning and Poon, amongst others, have identified how sort of normative ideals about gender and sexuality are very explicitly embedded into institutional expectations within those public roles. So Ning and Poon's research was with social workers, and they found that adherence to those normative ideologies, which included, for example, the idea of filial piety, that sort of Confucianist idea of being a good son or daughter, becoming married, raising a family, having children. These are expectations for every child, and they are directly tied to the evaluation of one's moral integrity as defined by the state, and actually factor into things like decisions about promotion and job security. So homophobia and heterosexism is very much institutionalized in state-controlled jobs. But despite that sort of emerging field of research, there currently isn't any research apart from Ian's, basically, looking at Chinese teachers and leaders' experiences in schools. So that's what this paper seeks to fill. And in terms of theory, so unsurprisingly, we're drawing very heavily on Butler, this idea of the heterosexual matrix as being this grid of cultural intelligibility within which people become intelligible or unintelligible as gendered and sexual subjects. But we were looking at what other elements come into that distinctly Chinese heterosexual matrix, and how Chinese citizens can become unintelligible for other reasons. We're also drawing on Foucault, and in particular the ideas of governmentality and disciplinary power. So governmentality being this sort of processes, not just of formal governments, but also of other state operations that define and delimit our freedoms and our behaviours as subjects within the state. And disciplinary power as being that power that operates at all levels and sort of infiltrates all of our relationships, including our disciplinary power over ourselves, that sort of panoptic surveillance of the self, which we'll talk about. And then finally, we are drawing on Michel de Certier's idea of strategies versus tactics of power. So de Certier said that strategies of power are those kind of overarching dominant power systems, like the Chinese Communist Party at the biggest level in this context, or also heteronormative power, homophobic power. And those are systems of power that create a space in which to act. Tactics are those sort of bubbling acts of resistance that can only create spaces within existing structures of power. And we'll go on to talk about the sort of tactical opportunities that the teachers and leaders in this research found to resist those more overarching systems. So over to Ian on methods.
Yes, thank you, Catherine. So I'm now going to talk about the methods, focusing on how we recruited our participants and ensured their anonymity given the sensitive context. So we chose WeChat as our recruitment platform. So WeChat is kind of like WhatsApp. WeChat is China's most popular instant messaging app, and the group chats comprising LGBT members are already existing there. So we posted our recruitment information to these group chats to reach out to this hidden population. So access to these groups was scanned by my insider identity as a Chinese gay man, which was made clear in the recruitment post. Then participants contacted me using their pseudonyms and non-personal pictures. This method ensured they remained anonymous throughout the recruitment process. So after the recruitment, so each participant took part in one-on-one semi-structured interview with me on Zoom. And to further protect their safety, they are advised to use pseudonyms to join the meetings and were given the option to turn off their cameras. So the interviews were conducted in Mandarin Chinese, and each lasted around 60 minutes. So we used reflexive thematic analysis to analyze the data. So both Catherine and I participated in the data analyzing process, but in different stages, utilizing our own cultural competency. So more specifically, I coded the full data set and generated the initial themes in Mandarin Chinese so that the contextual nuances of the original data set could be preserved. Following that, I translated the initial themes into English and met together with Catherine for discussion. So during these meetings, we reviewed codes and themes together, compared language differences, and clarified specific concepts and expressions. So finally, we developed 3 themes. The first one is Chinese heterosexual matrix. The second one is disrupting heteronormativity as a teacher. And the third, disrupting heteronormativity as a leader. And then before we move to our findings, I would like to introduce the participant demographics. So we recruited 3 participants, including 2 gay men and 1 lesbian, who hold mid-level leadership positions at 3 different schools in China. So more specifically here, so the first one is Fang. He is a gay man who works as a secondary school. He had 3 different roles in the school: mathematics teacher, teaching and research team leader, and a mid-level administrator, for example, and he helps organizing teacher training at his school. He is completely closeted at school and is in a pro forma marriage with a lesbian. So here, pro forma marriage means that it's kind of like a covered marriage. So he is perceived as a straight man in a marriage at his school. So actually, this pro forma marriage with the lesbian, with this cooperating, helping each other marriage is very common in China. It's one of the strategies LGBT people use to protect their identity. And the second participant is Li Lei. He is a gay man and works as a secondary school. He is a history teacher and a lesson preparation team leader. And he does not open his sexuality at school except to 1 gay colleague. And then the third one is Anna. She is a lesbian Chinese teacher, and her school is primary, secondary integrated. And she is in charge of the secondary division and co-develops the curricula with her head teacher. So she is also closeted at her school. Yeah, that's the participants' information.
Right, so moving on then to the sort of key themes that we identified in this data. The first of those is the title of this talk, so this idea of the Chinese heterosexual matrix. We were really struck by the very particular ways in which heteronormativity was maintained in the context of these Chinese schools. and in certain ways that felt quite unique to the Chinese context, whilst others were very similar to those that we might see in the Western context. Two of the sort of constitutive features of that matrix were silence and surveillance. So these were things that came up really clearly throughout all of our participants' narratives that I'll talk about now. And we saw those two things as operating together to construct a uniquely Chinese heterosexual matrix in these schools. And that matrix was fortified from lots of different angles. So by ideological support from the senior leadership team, many of whom would have been members of the Chinese Communist Party, by Confucianist values like those of filial piety that I've talked about, and by the Chinese party state at a more formal level. So, yeah, really strong support from all angles, maintaining this sort of ideological matrix that our participants were operating within. So in terms of silence, there were various ways in which we observed LGBTQ identities as being both unspoken within schools and unspeakable. So one of our participants, Fang, who was the gay man in a pro forma marriage with a lesbian, completely closeted in school, he spoke about there being this, his school as being sort of tolerant was a word that he used, which was interesting, because when he went on to talk about what that meant, he said, well, the school's tolerant because we don't clearly identify who we are. The school don't know, so the attitude is tolerant. It's possible that by the time that you really identify yourself, it's possible they won't be so forgiving. So that sort of silent approach that also Ian pointed out in terms of no encouraging, no promotion.
Neutral.
Yeah, neutrality created this sort of quite odd concept of silent tolerance, which really meant not revealing yourself for the sake of your safety and job security. And then Lile spoke about the sort of heteronormative temporality and trajectory that's very much explicitly expected from workers in the public sector and in his school in particular. So he said schools in China tend to be very traditional and conservative. They require people to get married, have children and buy a house. My school is even more like this because the political atmosphere is pro-authority and pro-ruling party. So that's very much a sort of general expectation, but even more so in a school that explicitly recognises its sort of pro-CCP allegiances. And we found the word require really interesting there in terms of how it links to Halberstam's idea of heteronormative temporality. So the expectation that we should follow these heteronormative life trajectories, get married, buy a house, have children, as being really actually institutionally as well as more loosely or socially embedded. That's an expectation of good Chinese citizens and workers. And actually being a teacher who doesn't conform to the expectations can be perceived as evidence of insubordination or you know, a lack of allegiance to those Communist Party ideals. So because of that culture of silence, lots of our participants used the sorts of identity management strategies that I mentioned before to navigate that heteronormative climate. So passing and covering we saw from many teachers. So Fang's very sort of extreme or not as extreme as we might think, as Ian points out, that being quite a common strategy, a gay man marrying a lesbian in China as a sort of strategy of safety. And Fang said, what should I do? I can't marry the same sex. And my family was under pressure. Colleagues at work would ask about it. There was pressure from them as well. So participants passed as straight and also took more sort of subtle steps to cover their gay relationship, their gay identities, even if not trying to sort of pass explicitly. They also maintained a separation between their sort of life outside of school and their life within. The really telling quote from Fang, he said, I have 2 mobile phone numbers, 2 WeChat accounts, and 2 QQ numbers, all of which are completely separate. I go to an event in the circle on the weekend. In front of my colleagues in the unit, I'm completely shown as a straight man. So we've seen discussions of separation of personal and professional life in the literature, but the extent to which it manifested in some of these participants' narratives was really striking, having these very, very clear two separate lives to maintain safety and security. And then that idea of performing the super teacher identity, so having to go above and beyond other teachers to really sort of protect oneself from difficulty or attack and sort of be above reproach in terms of professional identity and reputation. So Fang says, I won't lie flat. I still feel that we are different from others. You have to be more motivated. You can't lie flat and go with the flow. So being sort of always on alert, going above and beyond as a strategy of protection. And really interestingly, the one woman participant that Ian had spoke about that super teacher identity being a strategy to counter both gender and sexuality marginalisation. So Anna talked about a very sort of sexist as well as heteronormative and homophobic context within her school. So as a woman and as a gay woman, she was operating multiple strategies to protect against various forms of discrimination. And she seemed to sort of suggest that coming out was sort of not even worth considering because she was already working against such prominent sort of gender discrimination and sexism, that coming out as an LGBT person was something, you know, that would just further compound her experiences of discrimination that already exist. So she said, whether it's at home or work, it's a different requirement for men and women. It's oppression, it's more demanding, asking you to be Superman. If it's a male teacher, you'll be promoted smoothly. So yeah, Anna's description of that strategy really sort of mirrored what Fang said about doing that in terms of his sexual identity, but was compounded further as well by gender discrimination. And then the second feature of that matrix was surveillance, again, really striking in all of our participants' narratives and captured really well in this quote from Anna, who said, working in the establishment, whether it's as a public teacher, a civil servant, a public institution, it will actually have a kind of closure in China. In that atmosphere, you'll become more and more afraid to speak. So for our participants, this sort of rigid culture of control in China that we've hinted at was particularly prominent because of working in a state institution, in an institution like the school, which is quite closely surveilled and complicated by ideas around childhood and schooling as being this sort of site of regulation of normative ideals and so on. And really importantly, LGBT identities in the Chinese context under the CCP have been constructed as this threat to social stability, linked to human rights in a way that's seen as problematic and disruptive. So we saw that surveillance operating in a couple of key ways, and those were surveillance of participants' marital and family status, and surveillance of participants by themselves. Surveillance of the self by the participant in this kind of panoptic sense. So in terms of marital and family status, Kong's 2023 book, which I'd highly recommend, about sexuality and the rise of China, he points out that under the Xi regime, the state has re-emphasized the importance of traditional family values like filial piety for the construction of a healthy, civilized and socialist family nation. It actively incorporates familialism into patriotism. So conforming to that heteronormative temporality becomes sort of an act of nationalist identity, adherence and allegiance with the party state, and not conforming to those can be seen as insubordination. So participants talked about being really explicitly questioned by colleagues and by SLT about their marital and family status. So Fang said, they asked me, why don't you want children after you've been married for so long? Is there a physical problem? I have a doctor who can help you. Is it that you are old and you don't really want children? So we kind of came to see this idea of familial heteronormativity as being another constitutive feature of cultural intelligibility in the Chinese context. So beyond gender and sexual normativity, being a parent also and being married were features of cultural intelligibility. And the questions that colleagues asked of these queer colleagues who didn't follow those life milestones sort of indicated that they were not intelligible in those colleagues' eyes. They could not make sense of them. What is wrong with you? Do you have a medical issue that I can help with? What other reason would there be for you to not have children? So, as we say here, familial heteronormativity, we have argued, is a constitutive feature of this matrix, further defining a person's ability to hear and make sense as a Chinese citizen and subject beyond those gender and sexuality norms that we already understand as being features of sort of heteronormative intelligibility. And then also really striking was participants' surveillance of themselves. So during Ian's interviews with the participants, this sort of seemingly safe space was created where there was all of this anonymity and confidentiality. Ian was out as a gay man with his gay participants in a way that created that sense of safety. And the things that they said clearly indicated to anyone listening to that interview that they were talking about their experiences as gay or lesbian people. And yet, many of the participants did not use the word gay once during their interviews. They would leave this blank space for Ian to fill with this mutual understanding of what that meant. So Fang said, I have a colleague at school, I guess he's in his 50s, he's never married. And Lile said, he's also, because I saw him on the software. So the word gay is missing there. So despite this kind of mutual understanding within the interview that this is what we're talking about, still that word was unspeakable. And we came to understand this in terms of Foucault's theorization of the panopticon, where participants were surveilling and regulating themselves on the basis of this assumption that the gaze is everywhere, that ideological controlling surveillance and hierarchical power could be operating at any one time. So we argue in this paper that the Chinese heterosexual matrix renders the word gay itself unspeakable, with participants censoring their own speech on the assumption, conscious or otherwise, that the gaze is everywhere. It might also have been based in kind of reasonable fears around surveillance of online activity, but as I say, for anyone listening in on that interview, it was clear what the topic was. So something really striking about just the inability to say that word regardless. We were going to throw out another Menti question, but I'm going to suggest that we talk about this in the discussion part.
Yeah.
What do you reckon?
Yeah.
In the interest of time.
Yeah.
So that's something we could talk about. But you can be thinking, based on what I've discussed there, what are maybe some of the features of a distinctly of a unique heterosexual matrix in the context where you're from. But I will pass over to Ian for our second theme.
Thank you. Yeah, so now I'm going to talk about the theme 2 and 3. So despite the profoundly oppressive effects of the Chinese heterosexual matrix, our participants found various ways to resist its power in their classrooms without disclosing their sexuality. So the first side, our participants find tactics to challenge heteronormativity within teaching practices. For example, Anna creatively makes use of her teaching materials and activities to address gender and sexuality topics. And as she states here, one of the units is the reading of practical texts, including newspapers and newsletters. So I selected some new news articles on gender issues for discussion. And then the second quote, she says, I extended this topic and did some classroom activities around gender expression and expectations. So as we can see here, Anna employs two approaches to incorporate gender and sexuality content into her classrooms, which includes reworking teaching materials and developing extended activities. So here, Anna's disruption might be understood as an exercise of tactical power. The tactical power and the tactics and strategy we talked about before. And so the tactics is a calculated action that can only play within a terrain imposed on this and arranged by a foreign power. So it means that you resist the power from the within. So here, driven by Anna's queer identity, she manipulates teaching content and thereby subverts the heteronormativity power from within. So, however, so this tactical power Anna enacts is partially granted by the nature of the subject she teaches. As she explains clearly here, she says, courses like Chinese by nature requires people to engage in discussions to develop critical thinking. So so here the Chinese subject might be perceived as more natural or suitable to bring in this content. And on the contrary, so Li Lei, as a history teacher, finds that his agency to bring gender and sexuality issues into his teaching content, into his teaching is more limited. And he says here, I won't bring this up for no reason in my teaching. Only occasionally, for example, on International Women's Day, I talked about women's rights with the students. So for Li Lei, the task of discussing queer issues with students requires careful consideration of finding appropriate reasons and timing. And he says, I won't bring this up for no reason. So for example, significant occasions such as International Women's Day might be perceived as compatible with his teaching content. And however, these scattered opportunities or teachable moments are subject to regulations by the senior leadership team at Li Lei's school. So this is also surveillance. It's also subject to surveillance by the senior leadership team. For instance, he states, on the International Women's Day, I talked about women's rights with students. I remember that at that time, our head teacher happened to pass by, and he was very surprised. He was patrolling the hallway. He may have realized something and looked at my classroom through the window. So I quickly skipped to the next slide, and I talked about history normally. So here you can see in the Chinese school context, disciplinary power manifests often as strict surveillance over teaching practice, exemplified here by the head teacher's constant patrolling. Under these hierarchical observations, so there appears to be limited space within Li Lei's classroom for challenging heteronormativity. And then the first side, we have talked about the first side is within the teaching practices. The second side where queer disruption can take place is within classroom management. So here, Fang describes, he points a girl with boyish style as the class representative, which can be understood as a tactical disruption of heteronormativity. So Fang says here, so there's a girl in my class who I feel very much like, and then, of course, I'm guessing. There has no clear identification and all can be only guessed. I will not reveal myself in front of them, nor will I point out anything from them. She dresses very boyishly, has short hair, and has a boyish personality. She gets along well with her classmates, and is quite authoritative. So I pointed to her as the class representative. So here we can see, as a closeted gay teacher, Fang acknowledges that it is impossible to speak openly about queer identity with his students. So therefore, identity this student as a queer relies on Fang's personal assumptions about her appearance and behaviors. Such reading skills, which is ability to infer LGBT identity, is very, very common in the queer community, especially for those who live within an extremely heteronormative environment. So however, we should acknowledge that using this mutual understanding or this tacit knowledge also might risk perpetuating stereotypes about LGBT individuals. In this case, equating boyish appearance and personality with lesbianism. So nonetheless, we argue that Fang's action here signifies a moment of disruption to the matrix, undermining the school's gender and sexuality norms and making presumed queerness visible within his classroom. So this is the second theme. And then I'm going to talk about the theme 3, disrupting heteronormativity as a leader. So our participants, they are mid-level school leaders. So they teach in the classroom. They also lead and do some leadership tasks in the school. So the third one is disrupting heteronormativity as a leader. So while participants discussed their ability to employ some but limited agency in promoting gender and sexuality diversity as teachers, so this agency was significantly more constrained in their roles as leaders. So in much Western thinking, leadership roles are often associated with increased agency. However, in China, education leaders face significant social and state control, which we have talked before. So this imposes unique limits on the ability to disrupt the status quo. So within this context, so fears of being outed by association made disrupting heteronormativity as a leader extremely challenging for all participants. For example, here, Fang, who is the mid-level leader in charge of the teacher training in his school, he refused the opportunity to cooperate with the local LGBT organizations. So he said, I have attended many events held by local LGBT organizations, but I never introduced these resources to my school. In fact, some of them have asked me to co-organize some activities on gender and sexuality at my school. I refused them directly because I needed to protect myself after all. I was worried about that if I did so, my colleagues would associate me with homosexuality. So here we can see Fang use this separation approach. As Catherine talked earlier, so he used this separation approach between his attendance at LGBT events and the introduction of LGBT resources into his own leadership work. So this is mainly because he fears that this could expose his sexuality to his colleagues and thereby affect his job security. So this can be understood again as a strategy of self-surveillance and one apparently amplified for those in leadership roles. And then similarly, so Anna, who is the woman and who is the woman teacher, she was most active in bringing discussions around gender and sexuality into her classroom. However, she does not extend her practices to a broader level at school as a leader. She says, because she co-develops curricula with her head teacher. So she said, I didn't show it very clearly when establishing the curriculum with the head teacher, but I gave myself a space and named an extended class as speech and debates so that it can cover these topics and meet the requirements of the local education authorities as well. So it has saved me some trouble. So here we can see, for Anna, the major concern when co-developing curricula is not get into trouble during the school inspection carried out by the local education authorities. So this makes overt incorporation of LGBT content unrealistic. So however, she still tactically undermines the strategic power of heteronormativity by creating a non-co class that she deliberately gives an ambiguous name which is speech and debates here. So, however, so this disruptive approach, we argue that it remains necessarily an individual action and does not extend beyond her own classroom. Yeah, so.
Yeah, and we wanted to sort of recognize here again a different article from Sui, who talks about the sort of Western literature on role model approaches, and that if we were thinking in terms of that literature, it would be tempting to see these kind of small resistances as being I don't know, not enough, as being too small to really be recognized as resistance. But actually, we want to argue along with Sui that in the Chinese context, the sort of institutional whole school approaches that are proposed in the Western literature are near impossible and represent significant threats to LGBT people's job security and safety, and that these kind of tiny acts of tactical resistance should really be recognized as significant moments of disruption. And those sorts of one-to-one disruptions where Fang, you know, albeit making assumptions about the sexual identity of a person based on their appearance, is still sort of mobilizing tactical resistance to heteronormativity in a way that poses some threat or sort of a tiny chink into the armor of the particularly rigid matrix in the Chinese context.
Yeah, and we still have last example of this tactical resistance. Yeah, so another example of this tactical resistance of heteronormativity comes from Fang, who organized a teacher training section for his colleagues, which included one LGBT-friendly straight professor. Here, so he says here, there's only one time for myself bringing the LGBT-related resources to my school. I invited one LGBT-friendly straight professor who I met through LGBT organizations to give a teacher training session in my school. So he mentioned that homosexuality was no longer a mental illness, but our teachers had no reaction on it. So we can see Fang's one-time effort to introduce LGBT resources to his school is highly cautious. He ensures that the invited professor is straight, but LGBT-friendly, and the chosen training theme is about students' well-being, so that he could avoid any unintentional disclosure of his own sexuality. So, however, this teachable moment on sexuality slipped away quickly, and its attempted impact remained unknown because the teachers had no reaction on it. So in this sense, we can argue that Fang's disruptive leadership attempt had limited impact in challenging heteronormativity in his school. So yeah, that's our 3 themes. Yeah.
Yeah, so all right, but maybe a bit over time. So just to sort of summarize in terms of conclusions and implications of this going forward, we hope that we're making some theoretical and empirical contributions with this article. As I say, it's still in progress. The theoretical one being we're trying to sort of extend theorizations of the heterosexual matrix, which are often based in kind of a Western context, to think about what this looks like in China and perhaps other sort of authoritarian contexts. So we've argued that the heterosexual matrix is constituted by these 2 main features of silence and surveillance. And some of the manifestations of this were the explicit questioning of marital and family status and the impact of this on participants' career progression. So we didn't include this, but there were quotes from participants who talked about, you know, if I were heterosexual, I'd be able to spend time with colleagues outside of work, develop the sorts of connections that would allow me to progress to leadership positions. That is not possible to me because of the those self-protective strategies that I have to use. We also argued that familial heteronormativity, which is Kong's concept, is a sort of fairly unique feature of cultural intelligibility in the Chinese context. So beyond gender and sexuality norms, also that expectation to be married and have children is really key to being able to make sense of someone as a culturally intelligible person. And finally, the unspeakability of the word gay by participants themselves, even when they were actually talking fairly openly about their experiences as lesbian and gay people, they still couldn't say the word gay because of that sort of panoptic gaze in the Foucauldian sense, or really rigid culture of control that they were operating within. And then empirically, this is, as far as we know, the first piece of research looking at Chinese school teachers and leaders' experiences. So we think it's really important that research looks into those experiences and kind of amplifies those voices in whatever ways possible. And also, we want to highlight and continue to look at what kind of small tactical opportunities exist for resistance within these contexts. You know, the sorts of institutional, whole school, anti-heteronormativity approaches that we're talking about in the West do not translate over in the schools that these participants are working within. So what opportunities do exist for them, in addition to what they're doing already, in order to navigate and survive within the culture of sort of societal and political heteronormativity that we've talked about today. So that's kind of
Perfect timing.
1:30. Can you believe it? We've got some notes on sort of our background and tips, which was requested, but shall we stop first to discuss questions and comments based on what we've talked about?
Yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, it was just fascinating, and well, fascinating and depressing in equal measure, I think.
Yeah, research needs to be, doesn't it?
Absolutely. So we've got a good half hour for questions. I can see lots of applause in the audience. So people, feel free to turn your cameras back on, and as I said, you can put questions in the chat or just raise your hand and ask them, and we can have a good discussion. So does anybody want to kick off with a question? If not, I will, because I've got loads. I'll start off with one. I mean, as I say, I mean, it was really interesting, and there's loads of things that I could ask, but I'll just start off with saying, I mean, clearly there's so much fear. I mean, it sounds like you did really well to actually manage to get participants who felt safe enough to even be involved. And I was just wondering, I mean, what you were saying was basically it was tolerated if it was invisible. But were there any instances of it not being invisible, and what are the consequences? Is it that people don't know the consequences and live in fear of them, or do the people know what the consequences would be if they were outed?
Yes, actually, people know that there are consequences if they are being too visible. I can give you several examples. One is through social media. So that's the reason why I use WeChat, because WeChat is very popular. Everyone in China. Everyone use it, and we have the LGBT group chats on WeChat, and we can use the LGBT in the name, and you know, in the group chat in the name, you can talk about your social life, your day life, but people are very cautious about talking about any demanding for equal rights or political thing in the group chats. They are very, very aware of, and if people say something in the group chat considered as not that is considered as very too political. So the group chat, the group chat organizer, he will jump in saying that, oh, please don't say these kind of things in the group chat. So people are already navigating this situation on the social media. And the other thing is the LGBT members on the group on the WeChat, not like WhatsApp, people using their own name and their own pictures on the group chat, on the WeChat. I think most of people, they use a pseudonym and their non-personal picture so they can protect themselves. So this is the first, like a day-to-day like interaction with the social media and of the being visible or not being visible. The first example, and the second example is in school. So especially in universities, and so a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, so there are 2 students put rainbow flags in a university, just put there, they leave it on the table in the gift shop, and they were punished by the school. But in the paper, in the punish like notice, it doesn't say that, oh, you put the rainbow like flags on the table. They just say, oh, you did some behaviors, how do you say that, not in line with the school rules or something. Like they didn't explicit recognize the behaviors, but they punished them in another way. Like, yeah.
Okay.
Hope this answer your question.
It absolutely did. Yeah, thank you. I saw a hand up from Yan Shen. It's not up anymore, but is there a question there?
Hello, thank you for this very interesting report. Actually, I did that by mistake, but I still I hope to express my appreciation for this study. It's really impressive because I come from the same cultural background with the author, and then I know that how difficult it is to do research in such kind of a sensitive topic in our cultural context. I really appreciate that. It's a really impressive work. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Other questions? Comments?
There was a comment from Philip just in the chat, which was just really interesting to hear. Examples of disruption, tactical resistance, how they can have qualitative meaning. Absolutely. And yeah, doing this work with Ian and thinking through this data has pushed me as well to really question what can be recognized as meaningful resistance. And previously I might have seen those sorts of small acts as, just still upholding heteronormativity by doing so little, and actually no, they're significant moments, tactical moments where a more visible or institutional form of resistance just would not be possible, or would come with really significant consequences.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I wish I could have thought of an insightful question for both. I suspect I'll think of something in about half an hour. It really did, as you were speaking, I found my own sort of conceptions and perceptions completely shifting about what qualitatively meaningful research is. It clearly has that implication, so I doff my hat. Thanks very much. It was great.
Thanks, Phil.
And how significant those individual moments, so between, we don't know if that student who Fang talked about was a lesbian or gender diverse or whatever, but she in some way disrupted the gender sexuality norms of the school by being seen as boyish or whatever. And that one-to-one still kind of closeted act of resistance has significance very potentially for that student, as well as for Fang himself, in recognizing a moment to sort of perceive and be perceived, perhaps. So yeah, really has changed my thinking about it as well.
I mean, in terms of your positioning as a researcher, Weiyuan, I mean, what are the implications for you, this kind of research?
Yes, actually, so why the first thing is why I'm interested in this particular topic is, one of these my identity. The other is when I finished, I I did an undergraduate and a master's in China. And after that, most of my friends, they decided to work with the school. And because I was major in Chinese language literature, it's kind of like easy for me to find a job in the school, but I didn't pursue that route because I generally had this fear of being perceived as a gay teacher in the Chinese school. I feel like that I couldn't imagine myself. I couldn't deal with this situation in school. So I didn't do that. I decided to work with a study abroad program in Shanghai. So I taught Chinese to American university students, so which is easier for me to deal with. So yeah, so then I came and like Catherine said, the pressure of on LGBT on gay people in China is profoundly is getting more and more increased if you are getting older, like you start to think about the future, like getting married, buying a house, this kind of thing. Then I made a decision of coming here to do a master and then a PhD here. So this is like my personal experience that impacted me of choosing this topic. And then in terms of the personality, I really want to and give the voice of the participants, because these people in this particular context has not been researched before. So I really want their voice to be heard and respected in this way. Yeah, so this is my journey, actually. Yeah.
I just wonder whether for you it's actually risky research to be doing as well.
Yeah, actually. So there are some risks. We talked about this a lot with Catherine and my and the supervisor. So when we applied for the ethics, we realized that this research has risks not only for the participants but also for me. So I should do it more strategically and more cautious. Yeah. So we found a way. The first I did it online, so it minimized the risk of me. I did it. That's why I recruited the participants on WeChat, and then I did the interview on Zoom, because all the data is via Zoom, and then I did it here. All the data is preserved here in the Manchester in the Manchester uni storage. And the second thing is I received the funding from the university, so I didn't receive the funding from the Chinese government. So it's actually it provides me more freedom in this way. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, it's it's very, very well thought through, I think, and as you would expect and as you've done, but really challenging. Anne-Marie, I saw your hand go up, I think.
Oh, we'll give you a second.
Well, you were there, Anne-Marie.
I was just having a coughing fit. Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
No, sorry.
Sorry. That's been so useful. I can't tell you, on so many levels. I think from a personal level, I was imagining what it must be like. I'm a single person, clearly older, and then the fact that the association of one's marital status would then be made as an assumption of one's sexual orientation. So I think that was just a whole set of fascinating things. But I think in terms of perhaps a question, I'd be really interested to know what you feel your research might have to offer for many universities who are offering transnational education opportunities. We work with educators in our own BJTU, Weihai campus, and there are obviously lots of UK universities that have a Chinese campus or have a Chinese base. And I wondered what development work do we need to do with any of our staff who might be working with those students and colleagues within a university context, so that they don't inadvertently undermine or sort of out people without the intention. The point Catherine made about the little resistances is actually being major resistances and all that sort of thing. So is there anything you might want to offer by way of advice for us to be able to think about what we do when we're working with our Chinese colleagues?
That's such an interesting question. It's one that we'll go away and think about further, but off the top of my head, the point that you make about being really careful about going into that context and not, inadvertently outing, but potentially offering those smaller moments of recognition in ways that could be really powerful. And I understand it. There's sort of this openness in the Chinese university context, it seems, for Western ideas to be shared. But
in a limited way.
In the context of that's what the Westerners think about this. But whether that offers, so within, the Chinese campus of such and such university, research like ours or other queer research based in the West, but looking at China, presenting that could be this sort of site of disruption as well, where it's like, okay, we have this institutional protection available to us that we could use as a means of disrupting. And so those closeted students and staff in the room, if not able to do that research themselves or to be out, have that kind of alternative discourse brought in, and there is that moment of recognition. I'm thinking, I'm working this out on the hoof. But
I completely understand, but I think that would be something that is likely to have real mileage and usage for bringing about change more broadly, really. I'd be really interested. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Okay. Any more? I mean, I think that was a great question as well. Are there any other comments or questions? Oh, Edwin.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Hear me?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for this topic. It's a very interesting topic, but I want to say for the hoster about in the Chinese society. Do you know any the positive way about the LGBT person?
So what are there positive experiences?
Yeah.
Of LGBT people in China?
Yeah, because we have the same background. I'm Chinese though. Yeah. So for example, I mean, like they have the apps means blood, names a blood. Yeah, a lot of Rela means like Chinese lesbian. Will use the apps, and the gay people will use the blood and Chinese the software in China. So what do you have any comment for this?
Yeah. I mean, this is definitely something you can speak to more, but my initial thought is, I think it's as important for us not to sort of over victimize as well, or so like to recognize that actually, this is this super oppressive context, and there is little institutional, and I'm thinking to myself, But so yeah, there's this lack of institutional and legal recognition, and yet
Mm.
queer people are living and thriving in these strategic ways in China. So using the apps really strategically, taking these measures to create, you know, kind of hidden communities, joy and relationships and so on, I found. So I think Fang, although he was married, sort of fake married to a lesbian, he also had a long-term partner who was a man. So that certainly, yeah, there are positive experiences for gay people in China.
Yeah, I know that, but
strategic.
you know, in China, I'm LGBTQ person. I'm proud of this, but in my opinion, so if you live in China, it is like that. Apps means like the Chinese version grammar. Yes, means that name is that blue. You can free to use it.
Can you free?
Yeah, yes, exactly. But if you back to like the university workspace, you must hide you person who you are, you know. So, do you have any comment for this about like the if you you living alone, something like this, you can free to use. But if you back to work, back to university, you must hide yourself, you know. If you publish you're gay, you're lesbian, your classmate or your friend maybe it will judge you.
Yeah, this would be the case.
Yeah.
And also the interesting, because now I'm doing, so apart from this research, I'm now doing my PhD project in an interviewing LGBT school teachers. I have interviewed 25 school teachers. I haven't done the analyzing, the full analyzing yet, but speaking of this experience, so because China is so big and because the government policy is very ambiguous, so it really depends on the content of the school. So for example, like in big city or in the south part of China, which is like a more economically developed areas, so maybe the schools are more like open-minded. And then some participants have mentioned that they're not openly about their gay identity in the school. They're open about them. They're open with themselves. They are being like confident. They're being like they behave as who they are, but they don't say this word. They just like being confident in front of the students. But in terms of apps, most people mentioned that it's not appropriate, or maybe not the best way, suitable way to use the app in the school. Yeah, but the thing is, if you use the app on the in the school, if you identified some colleagues are gay or lesbian, then they won't point it out each other. They just like, I know you, you know me, but we remain, you know, like
we just have the space, you know.
Yeah. It's like like a mutual understanding. It's like this. So this is like some like thoughts about this question. And the other thing is I want to mention is you said like the positive thing, and compare with the Western context, because we don't have this major, you know, violence towards LGBT community or something. So so the Chinese culture is like a discriminated LGBT community in a very gentle way. I can say that. So it's not that violent. So this is not about research. I have like a trans friend, and she used to live in America. Now she moved back to China, and she said like in China she felt more safe, like walking outside, because people might see her a little bit different, but they just like stayed at her. They didn't do nothing. They do nothing to her. But and then from her experience in America, she would be a little bit like cautious, and she would feel like unsafe walking outside, because people can be very like violent to her or something, you know, like so this is like this is my some thoughts from my experience. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
very good. It's very good.
Thank you.
Thank
I really
you.
like your topic.
Thank you. Thank you, Edwin.
If you any support, please contact me. All right.
Yeah, of course.
you so
Thank
much.
you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And I think that last answer really highlighted the complexity, didn't it?
Yeah.
Well, it's really complex. There's one question. I think we have got time for a reasonably quick response to Anne-Marie's question, if
Yeah.
happy with it, which is basically about the implications for people, well-being and mental health implications for people having the pressure of having to mask and be silent and so on. That haven't got support and can't be out, and whether I don't know whether that's something you're covering or whether you've seen research on, but it must be very stressful and have severe implications for people's well-being, I guess.
Yeah, I don't know the silent side. So responding to the question, I don't know about the psychological implications, but I can talk about the family support and societal recognition. So actually, so the regulations on LGBT community becoming more and more strict in general, become more and strict in China. But there are some LGBT organizations are surviving or like supported by the government at the moment. It is because they locate this movement, the LGBT movement, into the family values. So they advocate these stable families. So their events is all about the parents are supporting their gay or lesbian kids. So they use this like kind of like a theme. So they organize lots of events to visualize how supportive parents can be, you know, like supportive or like helpful to their kids' development or kids' like a mental health. So this is like this is how we do things to support LGBT community at the moment. So we feature the parents part, you know, like how can they support their kids. So this is become more and more like a common in China. And yeah, obviously we should recognize that it's not always that the parents are supportive, because it's really depends on you know, the parents. For example, like the parents' education background, the parents, you know, their understanding, because not all the people have this privilege, you know, like yeah, for example, my parents, maybe they don't have this understanding of LGBT information at the moment. Yeah, so but yeah, so this is like how do we support LGBT community using the family theme at the moment in China. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, we're 2 minutes to 2, so we'd better start. So before I just finally thank you and let everybody kind of give you a big round of applause, I just wanted to say to everybody about the next online seminar, which is on Wednesday, the 12th of June, which is being presented by Alison Phipps, who's a professor in sociology at Newcastle. And the title of her talk is Neo-Feudalism, Platform Capitalism and the Re-Enclosure of Women. So I think that'll be great. So there's thanks coming up in the comments in the chat, but I want to thank you again. It's been an absolutely fascinating presentation, and what important research it is. And I look forward to seeing more of it in due course. But thank you. And if everybody, yeah, round of applause.
We never went back to our background and tips. We'll share the slide. You can have a look at it in your own time. That was the least interesting part.
Too much discussion, too many interested people wanting to ask questions. So thank you again so much to you. Good luck with writing up the thesis.
Yeah.
Thank you.